The silence was deafening. In one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where conversations usually flowed like expensive wine and laughter echoed off crystal chandeliers, not a single word could be heard. 50 pairs of eyes were fixed on a young waitress standing beside table 7, her uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice that had just delivered words no one in that room would ever forget. Across from her sat Richard Blackwood, a man whose net worth could buy small countries, whose name appeared on Forbes lists, and whose arrogance had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces by someone he had dismissed as just the help. The flush of humiliation was creeping up his neck as he realized that his attempt to publicly degrade this woman had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. What had started as another display of entitled cruelty had become a moment that would be whispered about in New York's elite circles for years to come. Because sometimes the most powerful responses come from the most unexpected people, and sometimes justice arrives wearing a server's apron and carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of quiet dignity. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, and the night she proved that true power has nothing to do with the size of your bank account. If stories like this inspire you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear will restore your faith in the power of standing up for yourself, no matter who's trying to knock you down. Sarah Mitchell's alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. The cramped studio apartment in Queens felt even smaller in the pre-dawn darkness, with law textbooks scattered across a fold-out table that doubled as her desk and dining room. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days studying justice while serving people who often treated her as if she were invisible. At 28, Sarah carried herself with a quiet grace that most people mistook for subservience. Her colleagues at the Golden Fork saw a reliable waitress who never complained about double shifts or difficult customers. Her professors at Brooklyn Law School's evening program knew her as the student who always sat in the front row, taking meticulous notes despite the exhaustion written across her face. What neither group fully understood was the fire that burned beneath Sarah's composed exterior. She had learned early in life that survival meant keeping your head down and your dignity intact, even when the world seemed determined to strip both away from you. The subway ride to Manhattan was her daily meditation. Pressed between commuters who barely acknowledged her existence, Sarah would review case law in her mind, preparing for the classes that would start at 7 p.m., long after most people had finished their workday. She had calculated that it would take her 6 years to complete law school at this pace, working full-time to support herself and send money to her mother back in Ohio. The Golden Fork occupied a corner of the Upper East Side that screamed old money and new attitude. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany tables where deals worth millions were discussed over $30 appetizers. Sarah had memorized every wine on their extensive list, could recommend the perfect pairing for any dish, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what customers needed before they asked. Her manager, Vincent, a weathered Italian man who had worked in fine dining for 40 years, had noticed her attention to detail from day one. "You're different from the others," he had told her during her first week. "You listen not just with your ears, but with your mind. That's rare in this business." What Vincent didn't know was that Sarah's ability to read people came from necessity, not training. Growing up in a household where her father's mood could shift without warning, where survival meant learning to anticipate anger before it exploded, had given her an almost psychic ability to sense tension in a room. She had perfected the art of being present without being noticed, of serving with efficiency while remaining emotionally detached. It was a skill that had served her well in the restaurant industry, where entitled customers often treated servers as extensions of the furniture. But Sarah carried secrets that ran deeper than her colleagues could imagine. Her undergraduate degree from Ohio State wasn't in hospitality or restaurant management. She had graduated summa cum laude with a double major in political science and economics, writing her senior thesis on corporate accountability and social responsibility. The scholarship that had made her education possible came with the expectation that she would use her knowledge to make a difference in the world. Life, however, had other plans. Her father's unexpected death during her senior year had left her mother struggling with medical bills and a mortgage she couldn't afford alone. Sarah's dreams of attending law school immediately after graduation had been postponed indefinitely as she moved to New York to find work that could support two households. The Golden Fork had hired her not because of her academic credentials, which she had wisely omitted from her application, but because of her poise and professionalism during the interview. She understood instinctively that her education might actually work against her in an industry where servers were expected to be grateful for tips and tolerant of condescension. 3 years later, she had saved enough money to finally pursue her law degree, even if it meant sacrificing sleep and social connections. Her classmates were mostly fresh-faced 22-year-olds who lived on their parents' credit cards and complained about the workload. Sarah attended every lecture, participated in every discussion, and earned top grades while working 50-hour weeks in an environment that could be emotionally draining on the best of days. The other servers at the Golden Fork had learned to respect Sarah's quiet competence, even if they didn't fully understand her. She never gossiped about customers, never complained about difficult tables, and never let anyone see her sweat, even during the most chaotic dinner rushes. She had a way of diffusing tense situations with a calm professionalism that made both customers and staff feel more comfortable. What they didn't see were the nights when Sarah sat in her tiny apartment, reviewing the day's interactions and analyzing the power dynamics that played out around the restaurant's expensive tables. She had developed an almost academic interest in studying wealth and privilege from the inside, observing how money affected people's behavior and treatment of others. She had served celebrities who were surprisingly gracious and humble, and she had served unknown hedge fund managers who treated everyone around them with casual cruelty. She had learned that true character was revealed not in how people treated their equals, but in how they treated those they perceived as beneath them. Richard Blackwood's name appeared on buildings across 3 continents, but his reputation preceded him wherever he went. At 55, he had built an empire that started with a single apartment building in Brooklyn and had grown into a multinational real estate conglomerate worth over $8 billion. Forbes had featured him on their cover twice, and the Wall Street Journal quoted him regularly on matters of urban development and economic policy. But money, as Sarah would soon discover, had not made Richard Blackwood a better person. If anything, his wealth had amplified the worst aspects of his personality, creating a man who believed that his bank account gave him the right to treat others as disposable commodities. Those who worked with Blackwood described him as brilliant but ruthless, a man who could spot profitable opportunities where others saw only problems, but who showed no mercy to anyone who stood in his way. His business practices had been the subject of several investigations, though nothing had ever stuck. He had mastered the art of operating just within the boundaries of legality while pushing ethical limits to their breaking point. His personal life was equally complicated. 3 failed marriages had cost him hundreds of millions in settlements, but had done nothing to temper his arrogance or improve his treatment of women. His current girlfriend, a 26-year-old model named Brittany, accompanied him to public events, but was rarely allowed to speak in social situations. Blackwood's relationship with service workers was particularly toxic. He seemed to view waiters, hotel staff, and retail employees as lesser beings whose primary purpose was to demonstrate his own superiority. He was known for leaving insultingly small tips, making unreasonable demands and publicly humiliating anyone who failed to meet his impossible standards. The psychology behind his behavior wasn't complex. Having grown up poor in Queens, Blackwood had internalized a deep shame about his origins that he now projected onto others. Every interaction with someone in a service position reminded him of his own humble beginnings, triggering a defensive arrogance that compelled him to assert his dominance. His business associates had learned to work around his personality flaws, largely because his ability to generate profits made him too valuable to alienate. But restaurant staff, retail workers, and hotel employees had no such protection. They were forced to endure his abuse with professional smiles, knowing that any resistance could cost them their jobs. The Golden Fork had been Blackwood's preferred dining establishment for nearly a decade, not because he particularly enjoyed the food, but because the restaurant's exclusive reputation allowed him to be seen by the right people. He typically dined there twice a week, always requesting table 7, which offered the best view of the dining room and ensured that other patrons could see him conducting his important business. The restaurant staff had learned to accommodate his demanding nature through a combination of professional excellence and careful management. Vincent, the manager, would personally oversee Blackwood's table, ensuring that every detail met his exacting standards. The regular servers had developed strategies for dealing with his mercurial moods and unreasonable requests, but Sarah Mitchell had never served Richard Blackwood before. She had watched from a distance as other servers navigated his demands, noting the way he spoke down to them and treated them as if they were invisible. She had observed the subtle signs of stress in her colleagues' faces when they drew the assignment of serving his table. What she had not anticipated was that their paths would cross on a night when her own exhaustion was already stretched to its limits, when the weight of maintaining her professional composure while pursuing her legal education had left her emotional reserves dangerously low. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither of them could have predicted, a collision between entitlement and dignity that would expose the true character of both individuals in ways that would reverberate far beyond that single evening. Tuesday evening arrived with the weight of accumulated exhaustion pressing down on Sarah's shoulders. She had spent the previous night preparing for a constitutional law exam, getting less than 4 hours of sleep before her shift at the Golden Fork. The lunch service had been particularly brutal, with 3 large business parties requiring constant attention and generating more mess than tips. Vincent noticed her fatigue during the pre-dinner staff meeting. "Sarah, you look like you need a break," he said with genuine concern. She smiled and assured him she was fine, though they both knew she was operating on fumes and determination. At exactly 7:15 p.m., Richard Blackwood's Bentley pulled up to the restaurant's entrance. The valet recognized the car immediately and rushed to open the door, knowing that even small delays could trigger Blackwood's temper. He emerged from the vehicle like a storm system making landfall, his expensive suit unable to disguise the aura of barely contained aggression that surrounded him. Tonight was particularly important for Blackwood. He was dining with 3 potential investors from Hong Kong, men whose backing could help him acquire a prime piece of Manhattan real estate that would cap off his most ambitious project yet. The deal was worth over $2 billion. And success would cement his status as one of the most powerful developers in the world. But the day had not gone according to plan. His lawyers had discovered unexpected complications with the zoning permits. His primary contractor had revealed cost overruns that would eat into his profit margins, and his ex-wife's attorney had filed new motions that threatened to tie up his assets for months. By the time he arrived at the Golden Fork, Blackwood was a powder keg looking for a spark. Vincent greeted him personally, as always, guiding him to table 7 where his guests were already waiting. The Hong Kong investors were polite but formal, the kind of men who evaluated character as carefully as they analyzed financial statements. First impressions would be crucial, and Blackwood knew he needed to project confidence and control. The evening started smoothly enough. The investors were impressed by the restaurant's elegance and Blackwood's obvious status as a regular customer. The wine selection met with approval, and the conversation flowed through the usual topics of market conditions and investment opportunities. But Sarah Mitchell's section that night included Table 7, and neither she nor Richard Blackwood were prepared for what would happen when her quiet competence met his explosive entitlement. She approached the table with her usual professional grace, having quickly reviewed the preferences and dietary restrictions that Vincent had provided for the VIP party. Her voice was clear and warm as she introduced herself and began to recite the evening's specials, demonstrating the knowledge and attention to detail that had made her one of the restaurant's most reliable servers. Blackwood barely looked up from his conversation, treating her presence as an unwelcome interruption to more important matters. He waved dismissively in her direction while continuing to speak to his guests, expecting her to simply wait until he was ready to acknowledge her existence. Sarah stood patiently, maintaining her professional composure despite the obvious slight. She had dealt with self-important customers before, and she understood that part of providing excellent service sometimes meant accommodating inflated egos and poor manners. But when Blackwood finally turned his attention to her 15 minutes later, his tone was sharp with irritation. "Are you still here? I thought I made it clear that we weren't ready to order yet." The words carried an edge that went beyond simple impatience. There was a dismissiveness in his voice that suggested he viewed her not as a professional doing her job, but as an inconvenience to be tolerated. Sarah's response was measured and polite. "I apologize for any confusion, sir. I was simply providing information about tonight's specials, as is our standard service. I'm happy to return when you're ready to place your order." But instead of diffusing the tension, her professional courtesy seemed to irritate Blackwood further. Perhaps it was the stress of his difficult day, or the pressure of impressing his potential investors, or simply the accumulated arrogance of a man who had spent too many years believing his wealth made him superior to everyone around him. Whatever the reason, Richard Blackwood was about to make a mistake that would expose his true character to a room full of witnesses, and Sarah Mitchell was about to discover reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed in the weeks that followed, but in the moment, it felt like watching a slow-motion car accident that no one could prevent. Blackwood's voice rose just enough to capture the attention of nearby tables as he addressed Sarah with unconcealed contempt. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand that this table generates more revenue in one evening than you probably make in a month?" The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to diminish as other diners began to sense the tension building at Table 7. Sarah felt her face flush, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, I'm simply trying to provide you with excellent service. If there's something specific you need—" "What I need," Blackwood interrupted, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, "is for you to understand your place. You're here to take orders and bring food, not to interrupt important business discussions with your chatter about specials that we can read for ourselves." The Hong Kong investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. In their culture, how a person treated those in service positions was considered a reliable indicator of character. What they were witnessing was not the impressive display of authority that Blackwood intended, but a revelation of insecurity and cruelty that made them question his fitness as a business partner. Sarah's training and experience kicked in as she attempted to de-escalate the situation. "I understand completely, sir. I'll make sure you have privacy for your business discussion. Please let me know when you'd like to place your order, and I'll take care of everything promptly." But Blackwood was past the point of rational behavior. The stress of his failing deal, combined with his deep-seated need to demonstrate superiority, had pushed him into territory where common decency no longer applied. "You know what your problem is," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable. "You people think you're entitled to respect you haven't earned. You're a waitress. Your job is to be grateful for whatever tips we decide to leave, and to say, 'Thank you, sir,' when we do." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Other diners were no longer pretending not to listen. Several people had pulled out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that might become significant. Vincent had noticed the commotion and was making his way across the dining room, but he was too far away to intervene before Blackwood delivered his most devastating attack. "I've been coming to this restaurant for 10 years, he said, his voice now carrying clearly across the room, "and I've never been interrupted by someone who doesn't know her place. Maybe you need to find a job that's more suitable for your abilities. I'm sure there's a McDonald's somewhere that could use your services." The cruelty of the comment was breathtaking in its calculated precision. It wasn't just an insult, it was an attempt to publicly humiliate Sarah and reduce her to a stereotype that would justify his own sense of superiority. The dining room had fallen completely silent. 50 people were watching a powerful man attempt to destroy a young woman's dignity for the crime of doing her job professionally. It was the kind of moment that reveals the true nature of both victim and aggressor, the kind of confrontation that people remember for years. Sarah Mitchell stood beside table 7, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had reached a crossroads that would define not only this evening, but possibly the rest of her life. She could accept the humiliation, apologize for crimes she hadn't committed, and retreat to the safety of silence. Or she could choose a different path, one that would require her to reveal aspects of herself that she had kept carefully hidden. The choice was hers, and the entire restaurant was waiting to see what she would do. For 3 years, Sarah had perfected the art of professional invisibility, of providing excellent service while remaining emotionally detached from the casual cruelties of entitled customers. But there are moments when silence becomes complicity, when dignity demands a response regardless of the consequences. Richard Blackwood had no idea that he had just challenged someone who possessed not only the intelligence to match his verbal assault, but the moral courage to stand up to him in ways that would expose his cruelty to everyone present. In the silence that followed Blackwood's attack, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. She had spent 3 years serving people who treated her as if she were invisible, accepting their condescension with professional grace while pursuing her education in the shadows. But there are moments when hiding your true self becomes more costly than revealing it. What Richard Blackwood didn't know, what none of the restaurant's customers understood, was that the young woman standing beside table 7 possessed knowledge and experience that reached far beyond the confines of the Golden Fork. Sarah's undergraduate thesis on corporate accountability hadn't been an abstract academic exercise. She had spent months researching the practices of major real estate developers, documenting patterns of exploitation and ethical violations that rarely made headlines but destroyed communities nonetheless. Her research had been so thorough that 2 professors had encouraged her to consider a career in investigative journalism. Among the companies she had studied was Blackwood Development Group. She knew about the elderly tenants who had been forced from rent-controlled apartments through harassment and intimidation. She knew about the construction workers who had been cheated out of wages on projects that generated millions in profits. She knew about the environmental violations that had been covered up through legal technicalities and strategic campaign contributions. But more than that, she understood the psychology of men like Richard Blackwood. Her constitutional law classes had taught her about power and its abuse. Her coursework in contract law had shown her how wealth could be weaponized against those who lacked resources to fight back. Her studies in ethics had given her a framework for understanding the moral bankruptcy that often accompanied financial success. Standing in that silent dining room, Sarah realized that she possessed something more valuable than Richard Blackwood's billions: the knowledge to hold him accountable for his actions and the moral clarity to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a quiet authority that no one in the room had expected. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone perfectly calm and professional, "I believe you may have me confused with someone else." Or the simplicity of her response caught him off guard. He had expected tears, anger, or submission. Instead, she was speaking to him as an equal, with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than professional training. "I'm not sure what you mean," he replied, but his voice lacked the aggressive certainty he had displayed moments before. Sarah took a small step closer to the table, her posture straight, and her eyes meeting his directly. "I mean that your assumptions about who I am and what I'm capable of might be incomplete." The Hong Kong investors were leaning forward slightly, intrigued by this unexpected development. Other diners had stopped pretending to focus on their own meals and were openly watching the confrontation unfold. "You mentioned that I should understand my place," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly across the silent restaurant. "I think that's excellent advice. Perhaps we should both take a moment to consider exactly where we stand." There was something in her tone that made Richard Blackwood feel suddenly uncertain. The confident cruelty he had displayed moments before was replaced by a growing sense that he had miscalculated something important. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, but the question sounded more defensive than aggressive. Sarah smiled slightly, and for the first time that evening, she looked like someone who was completely in control of the situation. "I'm suggesting that before you assume someone doesn't belong in your world, you might want to make sure you understand whose world you're actually in." The statement hung in the air with the weight of a promise and the threat of revelation. Richard Blackwood was about to discover that his attempt to humiliate a waitress had actually challenged someone far more dangerous than he could have imagined: an educated, informed woman who understood exactly who he was and what he had done. Sarah Mitchell looked around the silent dining room, at the faces turned toward table 7, with expressions ranging from curiosity to horror to anticipation. She thought about her mother in Ohio, working 2 jobs to pay medical bills. She thought about her classmates at Brooklyn Law School, most of whom would never have to choose between dignity and employment. She thought about all the service workers who had been humiliated by people like Richard Blackwood and had no recourse except to smile and accept it. Then she made a choice that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone who was no longer hiding who she really was. "You asked if I know who you are. The answer is yes, I know exactly who you are." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the table. "You're the CEO of Blackwood Development Group, the company that displaced 847 families from affordable housing units in Queens between 2019 and 2022. You're the man who fought a 2-year legal battle to avoid paying overtime wages to construction workers on the Hudson Heights project, even though your company's profits from that development exceeded $300 million. The color was draining from Blackwood's face as Sarah continued with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You're also the developer who received $50 million in tax incentives for the Brooklyn waterfront project by promising to include affordable housing units that were never built. The same project where environmental inspectors found asbestos contamination that your company failed to report to city authorities." The Hong Kong investors were staring at Blackwood with expressions of growing alarm. Vincent had stopped in his tracks halfway across the dining room, realizing that something extraordinary was happening at table 7. "How do you—" Blackwood began, but Sarah wasn't finished. "I know these things, Mr. Blackwood, because I spent 8 months researching your business practices for my undergraduate thesis on corporate accountability. My paper, which received highest honors from Ohio State University's Political Science Department, was titled "The Hidden Costs of Urban Development, a Case Study in Corporate Exploitation." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly to find what she was looking for. "I also know that 3 weeks ago, your company was cited by the Department of Labor for safety violations at the Manhattan Central Project. 12 workers were hospitalized due to inadequate safety protocols that your company implemented to reduce costs by approximately $2.3 million. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen to what was happening in the dining room. But what I find most interesting, Mr. Blackwood, is that despite generating billions in revenue through practices that harm working families, you feel entitled to come into this restaurant and publicly humiliate someone whose only crime was trying to provide you with professional service. Sarah's voice remained calm and controlled, but her words carried the force of absolute moral certainty. You asked me to understand my place. Let me explain where I stand. I'm a third-year law student at Brooklyn Law School, where I maintain a 3.8 GPA while working 50 hours a week to support myself and my family. I've been accepted to internships at 3 different public interest law firms, where I plan to specialize in protecting working families from exploitative business practices. She took a step closer to the table, her eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. In approximately 18 months, I will graduate and take the bar exam. Shortly after that, I will begin my career as an attorney whose primary focus will be holding developers like you accountable for the damage you inflict on communities and individuals. The transformation in the room was palpable. Sarah Mitchell was no longer a waitress being humiliated by a powerful customer. She had become something far more dangerous, an educated, articulate woman who possessed both the knowledge and the moral authority to challenge everything Richard Blackwood represented. So when you ask me to understand my place, Mr. Blackwood, I want you to understand yours. You are a man who has built wealth by exploiting others, and you have just attempted to publicly humiliate someone who will soon have the legal training and ethical commitment to ensure that men like you are held accountable for their actions. The Hong Kong investors were quietly gathering their belongings, their faces reflecting a combination of embarrassment and disgust. Whatever business they had planned to conduct with Richard Blackwood was clearly over. But Sarah wasn't done. She had spent 3 years watching entitled customers abuse service workers, and she had finally reached the moment where silence was no longer an option. There's one more thing you should know about my place, Mr. Blackwood. I'm exactly where I choose to be, doing exactly what I believe is right. Can you say the same? The aftermath of Sarah's revelation unfolded like dominoes, falling in slow motion. Richard Blackwood sat frozen at table 7, his face cycling through shades of red and white as the implications of what had just happened began to register. The Hong Kong investors had quietly excused themselves, their interest in doing business with him evaporating in real time. But the consequences extended far beyond the immediate humiliation. In the age of smartphones and social media, Sarah's confrontation with Blackwood had been recorded by at least 6 different diners. Within hours, the video would be uploaded to multiple platforms, spreading across the internet with the viral velocity that only comes from witnessing authentic justice. The recording captured everything: Blackwood's arrogant dismissal of Sarah, his cruel attempt to humiliate her, and her devastating response that exposed both his business practices and his moral bankruptcy. The contrast between his entitled cruelty and her dignified strength created a narrative that resonated with millions of people who had experienced similar treatment from those in positions of power. Vincent finally reached the table, But instead of disciplining Sarah for her unprecedented break from protocol, he found himself looking at Richard Blackwood with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Blackwood," he said quietly, "I think it would be best if you settled your bill," and left. The request carried the weight of finality. After 10 years as a regular customer, Richard Blackwood was being asked to leave the Golden Fork, not by a corporate policy or legal requirement, but by the simple recognition that his behavior had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. As Blackwood fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking with a combination of rage and humiliation, other diners began to react to what they had witnessed. A prominent attorney who had been dining at a nearby table approached Sarah and quietly handed her his business card. "When you're ready to start your career," he said, "call me. We need lawyers like you." An elderly woman who had been celebrating her anniversary stopped on her way out to squeeze Sarah's hand. "My dear," she whispered, "that was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen." But perhaps the most significant response came from the other servers and restaurant staff. They had watched Sarah do something that each of them had dreamed of doing, but never dared. She had stood up to an abusive customer and emerged victorious. More than that, she had revealed that beneath her server's uniform was someone with the education, intelligence, and moral courage to fight back against the system that kept them all vulnerable to such treatment. The video of the confrontation began spreading online within hours, accompanied by investigative journalism that verified Sarah's claims about Blackwood's business practices. Reporters discovered additional instances of worker exploitation, environmental violations, and community displacement that painted a picture of systematic corporate abuse that had gone largely unnoticed by mainstream media. Within a week, Blackwood Development Group was facing investigations by 3 different government agencies. The Hong Kong investors had not only withdrawn from their planned deal, but had begun spreading word through international business networks about Blackwood's character and business practices. Other potential partners began distancing themselves from his projects, and several planned developments stalled as financing became impossible to secure. The personal cost to Blackwood was equally devastating. His social standing in New York's elite circles evaporated overnight as the video made him a symbol of everything that was wrong with entitled wealth. Invitations to charity galas and business events were quietly withdrawn. His country club membership was reviewed and ultimately terminated. But the most profound change was in how Richard Blackwood saw himself. For the first time in decades, he was forced to confront the reality of who he had become and the damage he had inflicted on others. The mirror that Sarah Mitchell had held up to his character reflected an image so ugly that he could no longer ignore it. The empire he had built through exploitation and cruelty began to crumble, not because of market forces or economic downturns, but because one young woman had possessed the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most. The weeks following the confrontation at the Golden Fork brought changes that none of the participants could have anticipated. Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of a media storm that transformed her from an anonymous waitress into a symbol of resistance against workplace abuse and corporate exploitation. The video of her exchange with Richard Blackwood had been viewed over 15 million times across various platforms, spawning countless think pieces about power dynamics, worker dignity, and the responsibility that comes with wealth. Labor advocacy groups invited her to speak at conferences. Law schools reached out to offer scholarship opportunities. Publishers expressed interest in book deals. But Sarah remained focused on her original goals. She continued working at the Golden Fork, though Vincent had insisted on reducing her hours so she could concentrate on her final year of law school. The restaurant had experienced an unexpected surge in business as people came hoping to meet the waitress who had stood up to a billionaire, but Sarah handled the attention with the same quiet professionalism she had always displayed. The most significant change in her life came through the connections she had made that night. The attorney who had given her his business card was David Chen, a partner at one of New York's most prestigious public interest law firms. When Sarah called him 3 weeks later, he offered her not just an internship, but a guaranteed position after graduation with a starting salary that would allow her to support herself and her mother without working a second job. "What you did at that restaurant," Chen told her during their interview, "demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and intellectual preparation we need in our attorneys. You didn't just stand up to a bully, you came prepared with facts, presented them clearly under pressure, and maintained your dignity throughout the confrontation. Those are the qualities that make great lawyers." Sarah's story had also inspired changes beyond her personal circumstances. The video had sparked a broader conversation about how service workers are treated in upscale establishments. Several high-end restaurants in New York implemented new policies protecting their staff from abusive customers, including protocols for removing patrons who crossed lines of basic decency. More significantly, the attention drawn to Blackwood's business practices had led to concrete legal consequences. The Department of Labor's investigation resulted in $2 million in back wages being paid to construction workers who had been cheated on various projects. Environmental authorities imposed fines totaling $8.7 million for violations that had been covered up for years. 3 families who had been illegally evicted from rent-controlled apartments received substantial settlements. The Hong Kong investors' withdrawal from Blackwood's biggest project had triggered a cascade of financial problems that forced him to sell several properties at significant losses. The man who had once boasted about his ability to acquire prime Manhattan real estate was now struggling to meet his debt obligations and retain control of his remaining assets. But perhaps the most important change was happening in Richard Blackwood himself. The public humiliation and financial consequences had forced him to confront aspects of his character that he had spent decades avoiding. For the first time since his early success, he was experiencing what it felt like to be vulnerable, to have others judge him and find him wanting. His therapist, whom he had begun seeing at the insistence of his remaining business partners, helped him understand that his treatment of service workers and employees reflected deep insecurities about his own origins and worth. The realization was painful, but necessary. His cruelty toward others had been an attempt to convince himself that he had transcended his humble beginnings, when in fact it had only proven that success had not made him a better person. 6 months after the confrontation at the Golden Fork, Richard Blackwood made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He established a foundation dedicated to supporting displaced tenants and exploited workers, funding it with $100 million from his personal fortune. The announcement was met with skepticism from many who viewed it as an empty public relations gesture. But those who worked with him on the project recognized it as a genuine attempt at redemption. The Foundation's first initiative was a scholarship program for service industry workers pursuing higher education. Sarah Mitchell was invited to serve on the selection committee, a role she accepted after careful consideration and extensive conversations with her mentors about the complexities of justice and forgiveness. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell walked across the stage at Brooklyn Law School to receive her Juris Doctor degree. The audience included her mother, who had flown in from Ohio for the ceremony, Vincent and several colleagues from the Golden Fork, and David Chen, who would soon become her supervising attorney at Chen and Associates. But perhaps the most unexpected attendee was Richard Blackwood himself, sitting quietly in the back row. He had asked Sarah's permission to attend, explaining that witnessing her graduation felt like an important step in his own journey toward understanding the impact of his past actions. She had agreed, recognizing that redemption required witnesses just as much as accountability did. During her valedictorian speech, Sarah spoke about the intersection of service and justice, about how her years working in the restaurant industry had taught her that dignity was not determined by job titles or bank accounts, but by how people treated each other in moments when character was tested. The law, she said, looking out at her fellow graduates, is not an abstract concept that exists only in courtrooms and law books. It lives in every interaction between those who have power and those who don't. Our responsibility as attorneys is not just to win cases, but to ensure that justice is accessible to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Her words carried special weight because everyone in the audience knew her story. The video of her confrontation with Blackwood had become a case study in law schools across the country, used to illustrate concepts of workplace dignity, corporate accountability, and moral courage under pressure. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself in an unexpected conversation with Richard Blackwood. He approached her hesitantly, clearly uncertain about how she would receive him. "Congratulations, counselor," he said quietly. "You've achieved something remarkable." Sarah studied his face, noting the changes that the past year had brought. The arrogance and entitlement that had defined their first encounter had been replaced by something she had never expected to see in him: humility. "Thank you," she replied. "I understand you've made some significant changes in your own life as well." Blackwood nodded, his expression serious. "I've been trying to. Working with the foundation has taught me things about myself that I should have learned decades ago. I'll never be able to undo the harm I caused, but I'm hoping I can prevent others from making the same mistakes." Their conversation was brief, but meaningful. Sarah recognized that while forgiveness was a personal choice that each of his victims would have to make for themselves, accountability and change were separate issues that could be measured by actions rather than intentions. The foundation that Blackwood had established was now supporting over 200 students like Sarah, providing not just financial assistance, but mentorship and networking opportunities that could help them build careers dedicated to social justice. The scholarship program had become a model for other organizations looking to address systemic inequalities in legal education. Sarah's first case at Chen & Associates involved representing a group of hotel workers who had been denied overtime pay by a major hospitality corporation. The parallels to her research on Blackwood's company were unmistakable, but now she had the legal training and institutional support to fight back effectively. The case garnered significant media attention, partly because of Sarah's background, but mostly because of the strength of her legal arguments and the clear evidence of corporate wrongdoing. When the hotel chain agreed to a settlement that included $3.2 million in back wages and new policies protecting worker rights, Sarah felt the satisfaction of seeing justice achieved through proper legal channels. Her success in that first case led to others. Within 6 months, she was representing clients in cases involving workplace discrimination, environmental violations, and consumer fraud. Her combination of academic excellence, real-world experience, and moral clarity made her a formidable advocate for those who had been exploited by more powerful interests. But Sarah never forgot the lessons she had learned during her years at the Golden Fork. She treated every client with the same respect and attention she had given to restaurant customers, understanding that trust and dignity were prerequisites for effective representation. She also made a point of staying connected to the service industry that had shaped her character and perspective. She continued to work occasional shifts at the Golden Fork, both to maintain her connection to that community and to remember where she had come from. 2 years after that pivotal evening at the Golden Fork, the ripple effects of Sarah Mitchell's confrontation with Richard Blackwood continued to spread through New York's legal and business communities. The video of their exchange had become more than just viral content. It had evolved into a cultural touchstone that people referenced when discussing power, dignity, and the courage required to speak truth to authority. Sarah's law practice had grown beyond what anyone could have predicted. Her firm now employed 12 attorneys, all dedicated to representing working families and individuals who had been exploited by corporate interests. The cases they handled ranged from wage theft and workplace safety violations to environmental justice and consumer protection, but they all shared a common thread. They involved powerful institutions that had forgotten their responsibility to treat people with basic human dignity. The success of her practice had allowed Sarah to achieve goals that had seemed impossible during her years serving tables. She had purchased a comfortable home for her mother in Ohio, established a scholarship fund for service industry workers pursuing higher education, and created a legal clinic that provided free representation to low-income clients. But perhaps more importantly, her story had inspired others to find their own voices in situations where they might previously have remained silent. Restaurant workers, retail employees, hotel staff, and countless others in service industries began to understand that they deserved to be treated with respect regardless of their job titles or income levels. The changes in Richard Blackwood's life had been equally profound, though less celebrated. His business empire had been reduced to a fraction of its former size, but the companies that remained operated under new ethical guidelines that prioritized worker welfare and community impact over maximum profit extraction. The foundation he had established had become his primary focus, and those who worked with him reported that his transformation appeared to be genuine rather than performative. The relationship between Sarah and Blackwood had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined that night at Table 7. While they were not friends in any traditional sense, they had developed a professional collaboration focused on preventing the kind of exploitation that had characterized his earlier business practices. She served as an unpaid advisor to his foundation, helping to ensure that its programs actually served the communities they were meant to assist. Their story had become a case study in business schools and law schools, not just as an example of viral media or crisis management, but as an illustration of how individual courage could catalyze broader social change. Students analyzed the confrontation from multiple angles: the psychology of power dynamics, the effectiveness of moral persuasion versus legal action, and the role of social media in holding powerful individuals accountable. But for Sarah Mitchell, the most important lesson was simpler and more personal. She had learned that the skills required to provide excellent service, listening carefully, anticipating needs, maintaining composure under pressure, and treating everyone with dignity, were the same skills that made great lawyers and effective advocates for justice. Standing in her law office on a Tuesday evening, reviewing case files for the next day's hearings, Sarah sometimes thought about that night at the Golden Fork. She remembered the silence that had fallen over the dining room, the weight of choosing between safety and truth, and the moment when she decided that some things were more important than keeping the peace. The young woman who had once memorized wine pairings and perfected the art of professional invisibility had become someone who could no longer remain silent when she witnessed injustice. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Her story proved that heroism doesn't always arrive in dramatic gestures or grand declarations. Sometimes it appears in the quiet moment when an ordinary person decides that enough is enough, when someone chooses to use their voice to defend not just themselves, but everyone who has been told to accept treatment they don't deserve. The lesson of Sarah Mitchell's story isn't that every confrontation with authority will end in victory, or that speaking truth to power is without risk. It's that dignity is not negotiable, that knowledge is power, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or wealth, but with courage and truth. In a world where it's easy to feel powerless against larger forces, where individuals can seem insignificant compared to corporations and institutions, Sarah's story reminds us that character matters, that preparation meets opportunity, and that one person willing to stand up can inspire others to find their own strength. The Golden Fork may have been just a restaurant, Table 7 just another piece of furniture, and that Tuesday evening just another night in the city. But sometimes ordinary moments become extraordinary when someone decides that truth matters more than comfort. When someone chooses courage over safety, and when someone proves that real power comes not from what you own, but from who you choose to be when it matters most. So the next time you find yourself in a situation where you could speak up for what's right, remember Sarah Mitchell. Remember that you might be more prepared than you think, stronger than you know, and that the voice you use to defend justice might be exactly what the moment requires. Because sometimes, when the world falls silent, the most powerful response comes from the person everyone least expects to speak.